I would like to welcome Hania Mahmoudian.
Well, thanks for the introduction. I'm Hania Mahmoudian, Global AI Ethicist with Data Robot. A very brief background about me. I did my PhD in astronomy, then switched to data science, and then I got interested in the area of bias and fairness through one of the use cases that I was working on. And that's how I landed in the area of AI ethics. So with that, let's talk about human-centered AI, ways that we can build trust in AI systems. So in my talk, I'm going to first talk about what human-centered AI means, why it matters, and lastly, talking about the trust aspect of it, how we can build trust in AI systems. Before we start, actually, I'm quite glad that Pradnya had her presentation before me because she laid a lot of foundations that I'm going to use in my presentation. So let's first talk about human-centered AI. ISO has its definition on human-centered design. So let's use the definition that ISO used. Oh, ISO is this. So what they use is, for human-centered AI, their definition is an approach to aim to make systems usable and useful by focusing on users, their needs, and their requirements, to make things usable, accessible, and also understanding how they can enhance and improve their quality of the lives of the users. So that's their definition of human-centered design. What if we bring that definition to an AI system? What does that mean for us in this scenario? What it means is how we can design an AI system that would actually capture this definition. The mission that we would have would be to build an AI system to be beneficial for humans, not to cause harm, and also it's actually having human as a focus of the process, how they're going to use this system, how they're going to interact with this system. So having that definition in mind, now let's talk about human rights, because that's also something that we should be considering when we are thinking about human-centered design or human-centered AI. So let's focus on UN's definition of human rights, what they consider that. If you look at that, we see these 5 general themes in them. Safety. All humans are entitled to safety. So with respect to AI, our AI systems need to be in a way that it's safe, it's reliable, and humans should be part of the process to make sure the safety of these systems when it's used on humans or when it's working with humans. The second is opportunity. All of us are entitled to opportunity. What does that mean is all of us are entitled to be able to have the opportunity to participate, whether if it's applying for a job, whether if it's being able to get some benefits. That means AI systems should not be biased. So we need to make sure that these systems that we are building are not divisive, so they're not kind of creating hate speech or things that would divide us into groups. We want these systems to be fair. The next piece is freedom. Similarly, we are all entitled to freedom. Freedom of speech, liberty, individuality. So AI systems similarly should be designed in a way that not to limit our freedom. So when we are thinking about designing an AI system, these components should be part of that. Knowledge. So knowledge, we are also entitled to education, entitled to know and make informed decisions. With regards to AI, you can translate that into transparency. We need to know what AI is doing. What was its goal? Why we are using certain data? or if we are the end user, we need to know if we are interacting with an AI system. So we would know if, for example, we want to reject the decision. We would have that opportunity. So we would opt out to interact with an AI system and work with a human. Lastly is dignity. So part of this aspect is to think about all of us are entitled to dignity. That means we are entitled to have our own privacy, confidentiality. So these are all different aspects of thinking about an AI system and the human rights side of it. So now let's talk about why it matters. Well, actually, human-centered AI, or in general, the AI is moving towards being considered of civil rights, social justice, and human rights aspect of it. We see all these headlines that now the public is thinking about not AI as a technology, but AI that can touch us in different ways. Sometimes it's around we're not trusting AI. Sometimes it's around AI is trying to harm us in different ways. So all of this can be viewed as AI being an emerging topic in this area. So it's important for us to think about human-centered AI because that would answer some of the concerns that we would have in this kind of headlines that we would see. Now, let's talk about augmenting humans. There was a question in the previous session around job loss. So one of the misconceptions, not only about AI, any technology that came before that, people were going to lose their job. Part of it is true. There are some jobs that would be replaced. But the reality is that also AI can create opportunities if designed properly, based on what we mentioned earlier. We can use AI to upskill, to create new opportunities, and just replace the mundane jobs, the tedious jobs that, again, was referenced in the previous talk. So we would be able to replace those ones with AI and improve the quality of the work that we do. The second piece is the power of AI. Again, that was another thing that was discussed in the previous presentation. What kind of task actually AI can do? We have this notion that AI can solve everything, as Pradnya mentioned, but that is not true. There are a lot of things that AI cannot do. So we need to focus on areas that AI can actually help us and leverage AI for those ones. That brings me to the third piece of it, how we can actually work with AI. So there are parts that AI can automate the process, scale it. Those are the areas that actually can benefit us. It can, bring out the faster process for delivering goods, reducing the price, improving the quality. So all of these aspects are the parts that actually AI can help us to improve how we live, how we interact. And that is how we think about augmenting humans through AI. There are parts that AI can actually significantly improve the quality of the life that we have. We all use Google every time that we hear a word or a term that's not familiar to us. Simply Google it. Right at your fingertip, you have the answers. The technology has augmented our lives. So how we can benefit from it? Imagine AI being able to change or improve the quality of life of people with disabilities, helping them navigate in a better way, faster way, having their own independencies. So that's how we think about augmenting humans through human-centered design. Now, we're going to the last piece of it, building trust in AI. Now let's go back to all the headlines that I mentioned. Why trust? Why it matters? You see all these headlines. Credit cards having different credit limits for different genders. Even a use case in healthcare that was supposed to be benefiting patients ended up discriminating against certain groups. None of these use cases were malicious by design. They were all simple AI use cases, but what happened? They didn't consider the human aspect of it. They didn't put the human at the center of it. Let's pick one of them, the healthcare one. What happened in that situation was they considered healthcare costs, aggregated healthcare costs over a year, and used that as a proxy to the level of sickness. At a first glance, might make sense, but the reality is that different groups interact with healthcare system in a different way. Some groups use it frequently. Some groups use it when they're very sick. End result, they might end up having similar costs over a year. But one group might be sicker than the others. And that's what happened. So this algorithm that was supposed to identify patients that are sick and would require further care to be prioritized and provide the care that they need, it ended up actually discriminating against them. So when we are thinking about building an AI system, we need to have the human aspect of it at the forefront and center of the design process. And we need to bring the trust, because then you might see that headline, is ethical AI even possible? And I'm using the term trustworthy and ethics interchangeably here, but to me, trust is a broader umbrella, that ethics is one component of it. So let's dive in. How can you be sure that your AI is trustworthy? There are a few questions that you can ask. Was it built correctly? Does it produce fair results, or it's biased? Is it learning the right pattern? Or does it make the right decisions? Even more a fundamental question to ask. Does it have ethical purpose? What is the justification? What is the goal? What are we trying to achieve by using this AI tool? Also, is it still healthy after being in production for 6 months? Or do we need to think about replacing the model because it's not performing as it used to? So when we talk about trust in AI system, one thing that we need to consider is it's a multidimensional problem. We break it down into 4 categories: people, process, technology, and regulations. For this presentation, I only focus on the first 3. People. There are many different personas involved in building an AI system. Pradnya mentioned a version of that, a core team, the support team. As you saw, they have different personas, different objectives. We also have the process. What are the risks? What are the benefits? How we should be thinking about managing those risks. Technology. How we should design the technology, what should be included, whether if it's in the evaluation part of it, whether if it's the governance part of it, how that technology should look like. And we also need to be aware of the regulations. What are the regulations out there that we need to make sure that our system is compliant with? Or what are the upcoming regulations? So we would proactively align our processes and our AI systems to be compliant with the upcoming regulations. So as I said, in my talk, I'm going to focus on people, process, and tech. So people. Why people matter? Because they need to have the right education. They need to have all the resources that they need to be able to understand what are we doing with this AI system, what each step in the AI pipeline mean, and how they can relate to that. So here's an example of how we can think about an AI pipeline and what kind of different individuals or teams are involved in it. Ideation, it could be senior executives that are thinking about new use cases, how they can use AI to improve their workforce, what their workforce is doing, the work, or even the processes that they have, the product. There's planning aspect of it, what needs to be done prior to that, what are the processes that we need to put in place. Alignment is one side of it. We can think about the data and modeling side of it. The data science team would get involved, data engineers. And also, after that, you would have integration and the operations side of it. So what I like to do is to group these different personas into 4 categories: AI innovators, AI creators, AI operators, and AI consumers. And each of these personas view this whole pipeline and the way that they would trust AI in a different way. So for AI innovators, for them it's about how we define it. How did we formulate our use case, the problem that we have, and what are we going to solve? How it's going to benefit my business, and what are the risks associated to that? For AI creators, it's about how I'm going to use this data. What are all different data sets that would be available to me? What's the quality of this data? What model I'm going to build, how I'm going to build that, and how I'm going to select the best model. What are all the evaluations that I need to run on my model to make sure it's aligned with our values or the processes that we put in place? Then we have AI operators, which for them, the trust is around bringing that model and putting it into existing or the new infrastructure that it requires. The integration process is what means for them when they would trust the system, how that was integrated. And AI consumers, these are either internal users of the AI system or external customers. What they view as trust, how the system is performing over time. Is it accurate enough for me as a user of that? Or how it's going to impact me? Is it going to be aligned with my workflow so I can easily integrate it in my workflow? Or now I have to change my whole process, the way that I work, just to be able to use this tool. That's how we can think about trust for each of these personas. What do we need in terms of education? For AI innovators, probably we don't need to come up with all the technical definitions. For example, is bias is a concern. We don't need to come up with all the technical definitions of fairness and educate AI innovators. We need to come up with something that's relevant to them. Risk assessment, how they should be thinking about a use case, for example, that healthcare use case. The education could be around problems when we define or formulate our problems in a wrong way. So that would be a relevant education for them to understand trust, to understand ethics. Similarly, for different personas, we would have different education for them. So first step, understanding the people that are involved in the process. So as I mentioned, 4 categories and how we should be thinking about it. First step, education for data and AI fluency. For them to be able to understand, when we are talking about an AI pipeline, what do we mean by that? What are the parts that are included? So they would be able to follow. In the previous session, we heard that the stakeholders should be part of the journey. And that's essential. They need to understand AI. They need to understand data. They don't need to be technical, but they need to understand it in order for them to be able to be part of that journey, to be able to understand and to be able to contribute, because in some cases, they are the experts of the topic or the problem that we are trying to solve. Similarly, for AI creators, sometimes it's about creating that common process. Data scientists tend to use notebooks, work on it. They might have different testing process. So when we are trying to have that AI system built, we may end up having with so many different notebooks, not necessarily a good version control process in it. So having that process of standardization on the type of needs that they have in order to make sure that their system is governed. Similarly, we can say the same for AI operations and AI consumers, mostly around governance and monitoring side of it. Now, let's go into the second piece of it, process. Any organization that's using AI needs to have a framework for their process, for their risk management. This also helps with understanding people involved about their roles and responsibilities, so we would have accountability as well as part of this process. So one thing to consider is that risk frameworks are not something new. We've had it for so many years as a safety. For any kind of projects that the organizations used, they always had risk management framework. It's just that we never managed to fully integrate that for our AI systems. So these are just two examples that one can think of around risk framework. NIST, National Institute for Standards, already recently put out their risk management framework that organizations can use and benefit from. So thinking about risk in this context. But having a proper risk management framework is not enough. We need to understand the impact. This is also the part that when we are thinking about the human-centered design or human-centered AI, this is one of the important aspects of it. What are the impacts? Understanding if we want to have an AI system to improve the efficiency of our employees, what is it actually doing to our employees? Is it just spying on them? Or is it actually helping them focus on the tasks that matter the most? Makes them more productive? Or it's actually forcing them to do things fast and reduce the quality of their work? So what is the impact? It could be internal if we are using an AI system internally, or it could be external. People whose these AI tools are going to be applied to, what's the impact on them? And keep that in mind. When we are talking about impact, there are things that we know. We already know about potential biases for mortgage, in lending industry. But there are things that we may not know as an impact, whether if it's negative or even sometimes it could be positives that we didn't know about. So when we are thinking about impact, we shouldn't think about it, oh, we are going to run an impact assessment one time and we are going to be done with it. No, this should be monitored throughout the time. So when we deploy this system, we need to understand how it's doing over time. One example of it, Instagram, when it came out, it was just an app that people would upload their pictures with a little bit of a caption. That's my understanding. I'm not using Instagram. But it was something as simple as that, right? No one thought that it might end up creating harm for teenage girls. And that is an impact that we learn after 2 years of using that. And that's where monitoring matters. Monitoring the impact of the system, because we don't know everything at the beginning. So giving us the chance to monitor it and be able to intervene the moment that we realize that there is something wrong with the system is important, the same way that just monitoring the system for its performance in general. And that brings me to thinking about the last aspect of process. risk and opportunity. And that is a challenge for a lot of organizations, because every AI system that you're building comes with the opportunity, but it also comes with the risk. So we need to figure out what's the weight of those risks and what's the weight of those opportunities, the benefits of these systems, and make that final call. And if there are risks, how we are going to manage it, how we are going to mitigate it. We need to have a process around it. So here I have a few examples. A use case could be around identifying at-risk populations, so we would be able to bring them help at the time that they need it before any harm happens to them. By itself, it could be a good use case. But the risk side of it is privacy concern, amplification of bias. And these are not really small risks either. They can have huge consequences. So how we would be balancing these risks versus the value, the benefits that these systems can bring to us if we build them properly. And that is the part that I will leave you on the process side, thinking about the risks, thinking about the benefits, and trying to see whether the risks outweigh the benefits or vice versa, and how we would proceed based on that. So the last piece that I'm going to talk about here is the technology. When we are thinking about human-centered AI, obviously the huge aspect of it is also the technology. We talked about the impact assessment. What actually should be part of that when we are thinking about the technology? There was a mention of it in the previous presentation that you run a pilot, you get feedbacks from people who were involved with, people who are going to use this system, and incorporate those feedbacks into the building process to improve the system that you're building. Part of it could be around governance. We talked about the process that organizations should have, how that governance would relate to the technology, how we should be thinking about having those approval workflows, or the process around security of the data, documentation. How are we going to use the technology to make sure that we have documentation about all the steps that we took along the process of building the AI system? Also, we talked about the behavioral checks. It was important for us that our systems are not biased. How are we going to evaluate that? What should be included in the technology? Whether if it's around testing, or whether if it's around monitoring of this system when it goes to production, what that technology should include for us to be able to check for these aspects of the AI system. And also the mitigation. What should be included in the technology if we see there is a bias? One option is to just shut down that AI system, or make sure that the intervention is a human get involved and they would make a decision. There are also technical ways that we can mitigate. You might be also thinking about using many of the techniques out there to mathematically try to reduce bias in your system. It could be before putting it in production. It could be throughout the process of the system being live. You would still focus on mitigating the biases that you see there. So these are all different components. When we are thinking about the technology, but how it should be designed, all these considerations should be part of that. So I touched on some of these in the previous slide. When we are thinking about a technology that you can trust, repeatable. If every time that you run it, you see a different result, there is a problem. Assuming that all the data that you put in, everything was the same, but you keep getting different results, that's already a red flag. You need to have repeatability as part of that, being able to have that aspect of it, being able to audit the system. And that is a problem if we are just having notebooks around, because you might change something there, you already lost track of what else has been done, what are the decisions that you made in the process if you don't have a good documentation. So thinking about a standard process as part of your technology is crucial for you to be able to audit the system. Also, it needs to be adaptable. I think that's a message that we already got from everyone talking prior to this presentation. How we can be adaptable to new use cases that are coming out, or even to the regulations. We see now more and more regulations coming out for AI. How we can adapt to that, how we can prepare ourselves to make sure that we are compliant, and the system that we are building is compliant to those regulations. So these are general considerations that you may want to think about when you're thinking about what should be considered or what should be included in a technology. As part of governance, as I mentioned, workflow approvals, automated reporting, so you would be able to generate a document of everything that you've done, all the decisions that was made throughout the process, the technology that you used. All the evaluations, whether if it's checking your data for quality, whether if it's checking your model for different behaviors that's important to you, or throughout the deployment, the monitoring aspect of it, all the checks that should be in place for you are important when you're thinking about the technology and how you can trust that technology. So here's an example of a framework when it comes to trust in technology. The way that we view it is, you can think about it in 3 components. Performance, your typical test for how well this system is with regards to speed, which is important in certain sectors. Is the system stable? Robustness of this system. Is it accurate? What are the data quality checks? So these are all different components that you think about trust when it comes to the performance aspect of your AI system. Similarly, on the operations side, security of it, the compliance aspect, the governance piece of it. Sometimes you also want to have business rules. All of these should be included as part of your operations. And the last piece, ethics. How would you incorporate ethics into your technology? Making sure the technology that you build is aligned with your values. It's explainable. Again, there was another question for the previous session. How that explainability differ from different personas that we touched on. For a data scientist, that explainability could be around technical evaluations that they run. For the end user who may not be technical, explanation could be as simple as, what is this system? What are we building? What is doing? And what's the appropriate way of using that system? Because in many cases, the end user doesn't exactly know what this system is built for or how it should be used, so they might use it in the wrong way. So the explainable AI would also help you give them information that they need to be able to trust it. Why the system made this decision? So they will be able to see the response, see the explanation, and see how they think about it. So this way they can make the connection. We talked about bias and fairness as part of ethics. Tests that you need to put in place in your technology to test for bias and fairness, whether if it's during your training time, whether if it's during your production, so monitoring for bias and fairness, and also thinking about mitigation aspects of it. The technology can also have that mitigation piece included. Thinking about privacy. Again, throughout your training time, what are the privacy concerns that you may have? Your data might have sensitive information. It might have PII information. How are you going to handle that? There are different techniques that you can use to anonymize your data. You can use differential privacy to help with some of the privacy concerns that you have. So these are all different aspects that you need to think about your technology when you're building it. And as I said, this is an example. For every use case, for every organization, this can change. But you need to think about the foundation for the technology that you're trying to build. So to wrap it up, we talked about the framework for trust. People, understanding their needs, understanding what is beneficial and helpful to them. So we would be able to provide the education and resources that they need. Think about the process. Organizations need to think about risk management framework and processes to help them to understand the impact of their use cases. And the last piece is the technology, which can include ethics, performance, and operations as different pillars of that technology. Combination of all these things would enable you as an organization or as individuals to be able to trust that system when you have all this information available to you. And as we talked about earlier, all these different aspects still included the human-centered design as part of the process. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. I think we have one here.
Thank you. I noticed that your risk assessment and risk operation were under the operations section. But do you bring in, or I'm sure you suggest people bring in their risk assessment through all stages of the life cycle? Development, testing, all that?
Yes. So I think are you referring to this one or the?
The pie chart, or even when you brought it in initially. That's okay.
Yes. So if I can get there. So this is focused on the technology side of it. So for example, when you're running your risk assessment, you might end up needing to have certain measurements as part of that risk assessment. How that measurements should be translated to technology. So this pie chart is actually capturing that. But you're right on point. When it comes to the general risk assessment, absolutely. At every stage of the process, you need to have that. There's one here. Though if there is anything on the back, I can't see, so.
So you spoke about auditability. At what point are you defining the KPIs or metrics that you're tracking? Is it during the use case phase? Is it when you're trying to determine, do we even accept this as a project? Or is it towards the end or somewhere in the middle? Where do you determine what you're going to track?
Auditability actually starts from the beginning. Why did you make the decision to define your problem in this way? That is already a first question that you should ask yourself. What are my justification? Why I'm doing this? And that should be part of the auditing process. And it goes on. Why did you decide to transform your data this way? Why did you decide to select this model? All of these aspects are part of auditing. And it could be also simple governance processes. Which version of your data you used? Which version of your model is in the production? Things like that. All these different details should be part of the auditability aspect of it.
Thank you.
I had a question back here. Sorry, I know you can't see me very well.
Yes.
Hello, back in the corner. Thanks so much for speaking. I had a question about, in terms of the framework that you offered of people who make decisions in this process. That was the AI innovators, the creators, the operators, the consumers. I was wondering, you mentioned about not knowing all of the risks at the beginning of the process, right? And that down the line, risks may become apparent that were not apparent before. And I was just wondering, in terms of that framework, who is responsible generally for making the decisions about what risks are worth taking? because that might appear different to different people along that process, or people beyond in the AI consumer category, perhaps people that are affected by the AI but may not even be consumers, simply people that are affected by it.
So with regards to the risk, one of the things that we need to think about is bringing all the stakeholders to the table. Generally, when it comes to risk aspect of it, weighing the risk versus the benefits, usually the management team are the ones who will make the final decisions. But I would encourage all these other stakeholders to be involved in the process. If the data science team has a concern, they need to raise it. Sometimes because different groups or different personas speak a different language, then we might have this disconnect or friction. So it's important for all these different stakeholders to be able to speak the common language, which is, I've been a data scientist, I know the challenge of it, that we try to show it with graphs, with charts, with data, and it may not come across to the other side to understand the risks of it. So we definitely need to be involved in the process, have these conversations going. So one of the things that I would always encourage is not to think about it in the form of a silo. AI innovators come up with the idea, they throw it over the wall, data scientists working on it, throw it over the wall, but rather throughout the journey, throughout the pipeline, all these different stakeholders would be involved. Because the sooner you have these conversations, raising these risks along the process, it would be easier to resolve them or actually make the final call of just shutting down the project.
Starting to go along those lines, how do you feel this conversation changes when you deal with different types of communities, particularly like open source technologies versus proprietary or bigger enterprise companies? When I think about this, I'm thinking about, how much is the public aware and involved versus how much responsibility goes straight on the people who started the idea and came up with the idea and maintainability afterwards?
Absolutely. So the governance piece that I mentioned, being able to audit, that already gives responsibility to different people who made the decision. So when you have your risk assessment framework, when you have those risk assessment documents, it already tells you, this is what we ran. This is all the information that was shared with us. And this is the decision that we made. And the governance processes actually give those assignments and accountability to the people responsible. So it defines a proper governance system, defines roles and responsibilities. And that already gives accountability to different people who are making decisions, who are working on certain things. For example, if data scientists are involved and bias and fairness is a concern, it's their responsibility to check the models. Other teams obviously are able to encourage, ask questions, but a proper governance tool would also enable to have that conversation. But at the same time, as I said, stakeholder engagement is the key in the process.
Thank you. So with the concept of ethics in development, and you mentioned the consumers being involved in the process, you flashed up a few snips of like chatbot AIs from other companies being either shut down entirely or pulled back, limited in some way because of what they were saying as a part of being exposed to the consumers. So at what point, I guess, would you decide ethically that you need to curtail development when the consumer's safety or sensibilities are kind of part of the development process?
So that's an interesting question. So there are aspects of it, as part of the impact assessment and the risk assessment, you set those limits for yourself. As it's part of the process that you would have in terms of making any judgment around the risks of a system versus the benefits. Obviously, in some cases, it might have been underestimated in terms of the damage that it can have. So that's actually the part that the monitoring side would kick in. Having a thorough monitoring process in place that would notify you if something is not exactly as you want it to be. You always need to have these thresholds in place and limits that if you pass that, and that is your threshold for, let's say, taking the risk. Beyond that, I'm going to shut it down because it's not what I wanted. Or even limiting the scope of the system, to some extent. Maybe that would help from the ethical aspect of it, that it would curtail some of the negativity that might result if the system is just put it in the wild and see what happens. So these are different tactics that you can take, but again, it comes down to how the organizations perceive that and what steps they want to take. But definitely these, not only during the development side of it, because there are times that, as I said, you either underestimate it or you completely miss that because you did not think that people might actually misuse the tool. So these are all different aspects that the monitoring would give you if you continuously monitor your system and make sure it's still aligned with the values that you have or the way that you wanted this tool to work.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question is kind of related to his. And aside from regulatory agencies that have to provide the explainability, in banking or medical, for-profit corporations, what is the governing body is there an overarching governing body that is, overseeing ethical AI for corporations? Does it exist? And I mean, especially with large language models and open AI with ChatGPT, I have a son that, it seems like, I know there was a South Park, I watched that whole episode, aside from the local schools, putting policies and governance in place, what is the overarching body that, that is going to implement ethical AI?
That is actually a great question. So right now what we have is generally organizations coming up with their own ethics frameworks or ethics principles that they put in place. And they may have teams to help with that in terms of governing, whether if it's in terms of approving or shutting down certain use cases that may violate their ethical principles. But overall, we don't have a good system. So it's up to organizations. And in a lot of cases, they're overwhelmed. I'm not going to say that they're completely ignoring it, no. But sometimes lack of education may result to that. But in many cases, they are overwhelmed because they don't know this is a new technology. This is new to a lot of us when we are thinking about it. So I think the regulations that are coming, sometimes they can actually clarify some of the ambiguities that we might have had in the past in terms of what should we do. So regulations can help. And sometimes things like, for example, NIST framework that came out, that actually guides organizations that may not be AI mature, so they may not have that comprehensive risk management framework to start thinking about it and start using their framework as a foundation. And NIST is not a regulation, so nobody's forced to use their framework, but rather it's as a suggestion, it's as a guiding tool for organizations to use. So definitely we can think about these type of it, and NIST is not the only one. Other organizations have put out frameworks, whether if it's around ethics, whether if it's around generally responsible AI. So we can think about that. And one of the things that I would say is each of us at our own organizations, we need to champion for that. And one part of the problem that we have is changing the culture within the organization to accept, because sometimes it might be a little bit of changing the process to make sure that we are aligning ourselves to aspects of, for example, explainable AI or other areas that I mentioned. So thinking about championing this topic in our own organization and having the buy-in from senior management, because they have the ability to help with the cultural changes that needed within organizations to bring the responsible AI aspect into every use case that we have.
All right, thank you so much, Haniye, for your presentation. Please, everyone, give her a big hand.